This is the artwork that we're using on YouTube for this. Today what we're going to be talking about is truth and validity. That is the main focus of this lesson. And as I've been saying, we've been building little piece by piece by piece over the first 11 weeks as far as how we're looking at some of the stuff. So you guys should have student-led notes or student handouts on the back there. And we're going to be going through this, talking about truth and validity here this morning. Okay? So let's get into the first point. Okay? So point number one. When we examine a syllogism, so let me back up. Last week we talked about syllogisms, the structure of syllogisms, and how to set those up, how to identify the major premise, the minor premise, the conclusion. We looked at tag words to help you identify that, and that's kind of what we went over last time. And then we looked at how you take a sentence and how you can rewrite it as a formal syllogism with two premises and a conclusion. Okay, so that's what we did last time. Today what we want to do is we want to build on that, right? So when we examine a syllogism, the first thing that we need to look for is the issue of validity. Okay? So validity and truth are not the same thing, as we're going to see as we go through this, all right? So when somebody presents to you an argument or you see something in a syllogism, the first thing that you need to deal with or ask yourself or figure out is this argument, is this syllogism valid? So validity and truth are not necessarily the same thing, as we're going to see as we go through this. Okay. Number two, we say that a syllogism is valid. All right. So again, we're talking about validity right now. If the conclusion is necessarily true, given that the premises are what? So what we're talking here about is, does the conclusion what? Follow from what? The premises, right? Do the premises entail the conclusion? Does it follow that if premise A and premise 2 are true, that therefore the conclusion would be true? That's what we're talking about when we look at the issue of validity. Okay, so again, when we say a syllogism is valid, we're saying that the conclusion is necessarily true given that the premises are true, or does the conclusion follow from the premises? That's what we're after here when we talk about that. Okay. So thirdly, then, in other words, if the premises are true and the syllogism is valid, then the conclusion has to be what? True. So if both of the premises are true and the syllogism is valid in its structure, okay, then the conclusion has to be true. It cannot be what? False. It cannot be untrue if you have everything correct. Okay, so just one more time. If the premises are true, that means they're both correct, and the syllogism is valid, it's set up properly, then the conclusion has to be true. This is a rule of logic that's going to apply basically all the time when we talk about syllogisms. All right? So, if a syllogism then has true premises and a false conclusion, so the premises are true but the conclusion is false, we would say that that syllogism is what? Invalid. Okay? So validity, again, let's just review. When we talk about validity, we're talking about a situation where if it's valid, the conclusion is necessarily true given the truth of what? The premises. Okay? If a syllogism has true premises and a false conclusion, we would then say it's what? Invalid. Okay? So notice in these two scenarios that validity is not the same thing as truth. So you could have a valid syllogism, you can have an invalid syllogism, and what we're really talking about is the structure of things. Okay? So in an invalid syllogism, the premises may be false, okay? But if they were true, the conclusion would also have to be what? True. So take a minute to think about that, okay? So in a valid syllogism, so again, valid just means, again, what? It's structured properly, right? In a valid syllogism, the premises may be false. So a false premise would, I am a cat. If that was one of my premises, would that be false? Yes, because I'm not what? I'm not a cat. Okay? So, in a valid syllogism, the premises may be false, but if they were true, the conclusion would have to be true. Okay? But again, we got a big, huge caveat here with the word what? If. Okay? So we're almost done with the first slide. Okay? Okay, so this is because, so why would that be the case? So let's back up. If in a valid syllogism, the premises may be false, but if they were true, the conclusion would have to be true. Why is that? Okay? This is because validity depends on the form of the argument only. Okay? Validity is dealing, again, I'm going to underline it a bunch of times, is dealing with the form of the argument only. It is not dealing with whether the premises are what? True. So I could have false premises, but you could have a scenario where if they were true, the conclusion would also be true. And the reason for that is because of what I've underlined here a bunch of times. This is because validity depends on the form of the argument only, not on the truth of what? The statements. So validity is dealing with structure of the argument. Okay? When you talk about validity, we are talking about the formal structure of the argument. Is it structured correctly? That the premises entail the conclusion and so forth. Okay? So that's why when I said at the beginning of the lesson that we got to distinguish between these two things, between truth and validity. Truth, in syllogisms and logic, truth is something related to validity, but it's not what? It's not the same thing. Okay? Now, before we move on, does anybody have any comments or questions? So, let's look at some examples here. Okay? So, second slide. Here's an example of a valid syllogism. One of the premises happens to be false, but the syllogism remains valid in terms of its what? Structure. So let's look at it. Premise 1. All dogs are brown animals.
That's false.
That's what?
False.
That's false. Okay? All poodles are dogs.
True.
True. Therefore, all poodles are brown animals.
False.
That's technically what?
Possibly true, but not.
Nah, I think it's probably, maybe, but we need more to go on. So I think we're better off saying it's probably what? False. Okay? But remember, we're dealing with validity here. We're not talking yet about truth, right? So this is a valid syllogism, even though one of the premises happens to be false, which is the first premise, all dogs are brown animals, okay? But the syllogism remains valid. So why would it be valid even though one of the premises are false? I'm not sure we're ready to answer that, so let's look at the next point, okay? If it were in fact true that all dogs were brown, which is the premise that we say is what? False, right? If it were in fact true that all dogs were brown, then all poodles would necessarily be brown. Okay? The problem with the syllogism is the falsehood of the problem with the syllogism is the falsehood of the first premise, not the structure of the argument. Okay? So in other words, the issue here is that this premise is false, not that the three premises are structured badly. Does that make sense? So can you have a valid argument that's not true? Yes. Because validity does not equal truth in these premises, right? So we have a false premise here. All dogs are brown animals. That's false. All poodles are dogs. That's true. Therefore, all poodles are brown animals. Nah. But is there anything wrong with the structure of the argument? No. Okay? Is everybody following that? So, we could also say, to test the validity of the argument, what we need to do is we need to grant what is called provisional what? Truth to the premises. Now, does that mean you have to believe them as true? Or you're going to just, for the sake of argument, grant that it's true for the purposes of evaluating what? The argument. That's what we mean by provisional truth. So the test of validity, grant provisional truth to the premises, and then see if the conclusion would have to be true. Okay? So this is a thought experiment where you are not necessarily, you're not signing on the dotted line that you think that all dogs are brown animals because you know very well that you've seen dogs that aren't what? Brown. But you're going to grant the truth of the premise provisionally, temporarily, for the purposes of evaluating the validity of what? The argument. Okay? Does that make sense? So, let's look at another example here. Okay? So here's an example of an invalid syllogism with all true premises and a true conclusion. Okay? So, premise 1. All dogs are mammals. True or false? True. Okay? All dogs are canines. True. Therefore, all canines are mammals. So we'll put true for now. It seems what? How many think it seems true? Okay. Bart says yes. Anybody disagree? Okay, so what are we looking at here again? Invalid syllogism with all true premises and a true conclusion. So have we accurately identified that all these statements are true? So then how could it be invalid? Invalid structurally, true premises, true conclusion. So that's different from the one at the top. Remember, the one at the top was valid structurally, but it had a false premise and a false what? Conclusion. That was my stomach. Anything? Anybody have any ideas here? All right, let's go. If not, we're going to go to the next one. Okay? So, what's going on here? Both of the above premises are true. So if you look in your notes, you guys have them there. Is it true that all dogs are mammals? Yes. Is it true that all dogs are canines? Okay? So both premises are true, and the conclusion is also true. But if you examine the syllogism carefully, you will see that the conclusion is not implied, and it should say from the premises. There's a typo there. Okay? Substituting the word animals for canines makes this clear. Okay? So we're going to rewrite this, and we're going to substitute the word animals for canines. Okay? So I'm just going to write it here. All dogs are what? Mammals. All right? Now what are we substituting?
All dogs are canines instead of canines for animals.
So all dogs are animals. Because we're substituting animals for what? Canines, right? Therefore, or I could have just done the three dots. Therefore, all canines. No, wait, I got to substitute, right? Therefore, all animals are canines.
Animals are mammals.
Are mammals, I'm sorry. Now, what's wrong with that?
Because not all animals are canines.
Not all animals are what?
Canines.
Canines. So, our original two premises were true and the conclusion was true, but was the argument technically not valid? And the way we're identifying that is we're substituting in the word animals for what? For canines. So we rewrote it, okay? We originally had all dogs are mammals, we still have that. Then we substituted, and now we're saying all dogs are what? Animals, because we're substituting in animals for what? For canines. So our conclusion then is therefore all animals are what? Mammals. Is it true that all animals are mammals? No. So is this a valid argument or an invalid argument? See?
It's so technical.
It is technical. It's forcing you to be critical. Okay?
And because, we would read it as canines are all mammals. But then someone might say, well, mammals are animals.
So let's go back. See if we can go back. All right, so all dogs are mammals.
True.
All dogs are canines.
True.
Therefore, all canines are what?
Yeah, are mammals.
Are mammals. Okay? So we've rewritten that now over here, substituting in animals for canines. All dogs are mammals, all dogs are animals, therefore all animals are mammals. We know that there are animals that aren't what? Mammals. So, if you look at the next point, let me get rid of this. I feel like I'm not explaining this well, so.
Well, the first one is more specific. Because a canine is,
So it's the lack of implication here that's the problem, okay? In the way that the way that the premises in the syllogism are laid out. All right, let me get caught up here. It's not, the entailment isn't as exact as it should be, and you see that when you substitute out the other words, is the point, right? So it's kind of like this. I could say 4 plus 4 equals what? 8. Okay? I could say 4 minus 2 equals what? 2. How would I check that? What do they teach you about how to check that?
Just go backwards.
You go backwards. I took 2 away from 4, so if I add 2 back to 2, I should have what? 4. So what we're talking about here in flipping these terms is a way to check the accuracy of what? A syllogism. Okay? Now let's look at another example here. So let me give you another example that's not in the notes. Okay? So all barn owls are birds. You can write this on the back or somewhere. All barn owls are birds. Okay, that's number 1. Number 2, all barn owls are mice eaters. Okay? Therefore, 3 dots. Therefore, all birds are mice eaters. Is that true?
no.
Are there a lot of birds that don't eat mice?
Yeah.
Okay? So if we think about this, are the premises true?
Yes.
Yes. Okay? So, is the conclusion true? No. So we have true premises and a false conclusion. Okay? So since this syllogism, the premises are true, but the conclusion is false, the syllogism therefore is valid or invalid?
Invalid.
It's invalid. Okay? And I didn't spell it right, so apologize. So we know that, right? Now let's do another one. Okay? So we can identify that that's invalid based upon those criteria. It seems to me that we're pretty good there. So let's do another one. It'd be nice if I could just... Okay, let's do another one. This time we're going to say all mice are rodents. Okay, all mice are rodents, premise 1. Premise 2. All rodents can fly. Okay? Therefore, conclusion, 3 dots. Therefore, all mice can fly. Okay? So, let's talk about it. Is premise 1 true?
Yes.
So we could say that's true, right? What about premise 2?
False.
False. What about the conclusion?
False.
False. Okay? So, you should be able to identify then, and probably initially think that this syllogism is invalid because one of the premises and the conclusion are false. But explain that, I'm reading to you what I'm supposed to say, but explain that the definition of a valid syllogism is not a syllogism in which the premises and the conclusion are all true, but a syllogism in which if the premise were true, the conclusion would have to be true. In other words, you would assume that all mice are rodents and all rodents can fly are true statements. Does all mice can fly have to be true as well? If you assume it, would it have to be true as well that all mice can fly? Yeah, okay. So the answer therefore would be yes, that this is a valid what? Argument, because if you assume the truth, then it does follow from the premises that the conclusion is what? True. So remember, validity is not the same thing as what? Truth. Okay? Now, anybody got any questions or comments before we move on? So, just to finish this out, the validity of a syllogism depends again on the form of the argument, not the truth of the individual what? Statements. Okay? Let's do one more. I think that the only way we get to the bottom of this is by doing this practice. Okay, so we've got two fairly easy ones. Let's look at one that's maybe a little bit more challenging. Okay? So we're going to say on number 3, all birds are creatures with eyes. Okay, all birds are creatures with eyes, premise 1. Premise 2, all birds are egg layers. Okay, all birds are egg layers. Therefore, all egg layers are what?
Birds.
All egg layers are creatures with eyes. Okay? Is it true that all birds are creatures with eyes?
Yes.
As far as I know, that's true. Can't think of any
Well, unless it's a
non-eyed birds.
mistake in birth, that he was born without.
Defect. All birds are egg layers.
Yes, I think they are. I don't know if there's any.
I honestly don't know. I think that's true.
Yeah, I think it's.
But are there other creatures that lay eggs other than birds?
Yeah, turtles.
Snakes, turtles.
That's right.
Okay, there's lots of other things that could lay eggs. Reptiles. Therefore, all egg layers are creatures with eyes. Okay, so let's talk about it. Are the premises true?
Yeah.
As far as we know, yes. Okay. Is the conclusion true? As far as we know, the conclusion seems to be true. Okay. So the validity, does the validity depend then on the fact that all three of these seem to be true? The validity does not depend on the fact that all three of these seem to be true. Okay. It's not the truth of the statement. Again, it's the structure of the argument. All right. Now, does the conclusion follow from the premises? That is the main question. Okay. If all birds are creatures with eyes and all birds are egg layers, not whatever I was saying. Let me start over. Okay. If all birds are creatures with eyes and all birds are egg layers, do all egg layers have to be creatures with eyes? Okay, so let's test it then, and we're going to replace egg layers with living things. So I'm going to cross out egg layers, and we're going to substitute in living things. Okay? So I'm going to have to do it here as well in the conclusion. So remember what we're doing. We're testing validity here. So therefore all living things are creatures with eyes. So we're going to replace, as I said, egg layers with living things. Okay? Replacing the words does not change the form of the argument. So we haven't changed the form of the argument. We're testing the validity by changing out what? The words here. Okay? I'm supposed to show you that the students, now that the conclusion is false, there are lots of living creatures without what? Without eyes. Okay? In this argument, even when the premises are true, the conclusion is not necessarily true. The premises do not imply the conclusion, so therefore we would have to say that this argument is what? Invalid. Okay? Does everybody see why? Any questions?
Are we talking insects or what doesn't have eyes?
Bacteria, for example.
A lot of living things don't have eyes.
That's what we're calling living things as bacteria.
Well, living things.
A plant's a living thing.
The bacteria, there's lots of living things that are alive that
Vegetables and all, okay.
that don't have what?
I just couldn't think of any animals.
Yeah.
I was thinking animals.
So what you do then is you substitute out, to test the validity, you substitute out one thing for another, and you might sometimes need to do this more than one time if need be. And if after you do that it doesn't entail, there's no entailment, or the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises, then we're going to have to say that that argument is what? Invalid. Okay?
So does that mean that both versions of that argument are invalid?
Correct. That's what that means. That's why I should have said that. Thank you. Yes, that means that the structure of this argument is invalid regardless of what you substitute in. And that's why you make the substitution to test, does it still make sense and whether it's valid or not. Does that make sense? More sense now? Okay. So that brings us then to the second part of this lesson, which is truth. Well, actually, we're going to look at some more tests, but let's talk about truth. Okay? So this would be your first slide, I believe, on page 2, correct? So once a syllogism has been examined for validity and it is found to be valid, it may then be examined with a view towards the truth or falsehood of the conclusion. Okay? So remember that validity is not the same as truth. We just got done talking about determining validity. Now what we want to do is focus on the truth or falsehood of the conclusion. How do we know the conclusion is true or false? If the syllogism is valid, then there is no reason to proceed further. So if you determine that the syllogism is valid, then does the conclusion have to be true?
Yes.
Invalid.
Not necessarily.
Did I say it
You
wrong?
said valid.
I'm sorry. If the syllogism is invalid, then there is no reason to proceed further because we know it's not what?
Not valid.
It's not true. Okay? But if it is found to be valid, it is still necessary to examine the truth of the premises. So, if you determine that it is invalid, do you have to go any further?
No.
No, because you can throw it out as an argument because you know it's not what? It's not valid. Okay? If, however, notice what it says, but if it is found to be valid, so can you have an argument again that is valid formally, structurally, that the truth of the premises may or may not be what? True. Okay? So truth follows validity in the order of operations. So if you think about math, somebody help me out here. You're supposed to multiply and divide in an equation before you add and subtract, or something like that, right? Did I get that right? Whew. It's been a long time. That's order of operations in math. There's an order of operations here where you determine the validity first, then what? Then the truth of the premises. Okay? So if they are found to be true, so if the premises are found to be true, then the conclusion must be true as well. Okay? Now we kind of already know that. So if a syllogism is valid and the premises are true, then we say that the argument is what? It's a sound argument. Okay? The conclusion of a sound argument must be true. So what is a sound argument? A sound argument is it's valid and the premises are what? True. Therefore the argument is what? Sound. Right? So again, this is a secondary determination. Do not confuse truth with validity. I've said that a bunch of times already. But once we learn the basic rules of formal logic, it's easy to see how prevalent this confusion is. And I have to confess, is it necessarily easy to grasp all of this right away on the first pass, or do you kind of really have to think about it? All right? And that's why, again, a lot of people, they bow out when it comes to logic, because it's requiring a lot of really specific, detailed thought about what's going on. Now, I want to make this point. In public debate, the applause is frequently reserved not for those who reason well, but for those with whom the audience agrees. So this is, this for me, I'm just going to tell you my opinion. And I'm not saying that I would never enter into a formal debate with somebody, because maybe I would at some point. I don't really have any plans to or desire to. And part of the reason is because I just don't feel that formal debates are very good at actually getting to the bottom of something. Because what a debate really is about is who's the best thinker on their feet and who can sway the opinion of the audience, and it's not necessarily formatted for very clear, orderly, methodical, systematic, going through things to make sure that everything is correct. I've seen a lot of debates where I felt like the person that had the more experience, was the more experienced debater, won the debate, not on the basis of their better arguments or anything, but just on the basis of the fact that they presented themselves better. But they didn't necessarily marshal better evidence or better arguments, but the people in the audience, they either already agreed with that person, or that person was just better at and more skilled and more experienced at going through the information. So I think we got to be careful here to not confuse, not only to not confuse validity with truth, but also when we observe and analyze things, to fall into the trap of, well, so-and-so won because, I just like what they said better. Okay? A real dialogue should be determined on the truth and validity of what's being said, not necessarily who's saying it better. Okay? Any comments or questions?
When we look at it, because doesn't it say somewhere in Paul's epistles that he wasn't, is there anything that where he wasn't a good debater? Because I know it says something where he didn't go out there where he's using fancy language or...
Yeah, you're talking about 1 Corinthians chapter 1.
It's something in there I remember where it says basically he was just preaching the gospel, and that, I don't know, it's...
Everybody grab 1 Corinthians 1.
Kind of in my head, but I can't...
Sometimes I know what you're talking about. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18. For the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness, but unto us which are saved it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, I will bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this world? Hath not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? For after that, in the wisdom of God, the world by wisdom knew not God. It pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe. So, Paul's calling, he's identifying there that does the world view the preaching of the cross as foolishness? Okay? For the Jews require a sign, the Greeks seek after wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified. Unto the Jews a stumbling block, unto the Greeks foolishness, but unto them which are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God, because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. Then he goes on, look at, skip over to chapter 2, quick. He's talking about the wisdom of God in mystery in verses 7 and 8. And then you come down to verse 10, but God hath revealed, talking about the wisdom of God in mystery, but God hath revealed them unto us by his Spirit. For the Spirit Spirit searcheth all things, yea, the deep things of God. For what man knoweth the things of the man, save the spirit of a man that is in him? Even so the things of God knoweth no man but the Spirit of God. Now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit which is of God, that we might know the things that are freely given of God, which things we speak not in the words which man's wisdom teacheth, but which the Holy Ghost teacheth, comparing spiritual things with spiritual things. But the natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit of God. So Paul, in this entire passage, is he downplaying his knowledge, his worldly wisdom, his speech.
I think it was verse 4.
Yes, that's it. My speech,
Yeah.
and chapter 2, verse 4, my speech and my preaching.
Because I wasn't using enticing words or man's wisdom.
Right.
You know, he wasn't trying to be.
So Paul's not arguing this on the basis of human logic and man's wisdom. He's arguing on the basis of God's revelation to him. Okay? So the point here is, I think the point you're making is that we got to be careful about not just falling into the person who's the better speaker,
Yeah.
but actually evaluating arguments. And I would say that basically that summarizes, in my opinion, most of the political discourse that happens in this country.
Because somebody could be a smooth talker and win every time, and just
Most people they just agree. They just think the side won. Like these presidential debates and stuff.
yeah.
Like a lot of them to me just are sort of a waste of time because people already know who their person is, and I question how many people are actually persuaded by these things. Maybe I'm too cynical. I don't know, but I don't feel like there's a lot of real strong engagement going on. If somebody thinks different, I'll be happy to.
According to a teacher I had at school, he says there's no mugwumps out there.
There's no what?
Mugwumps. And then you would say, what's a mugwump? Well, your mug's on one side of the fence and your wump's on the other.
Yeah.
So you're not going to persuade them.
I mean, I'm sure there are fence sitters, of course, but I don't know. You guys think I'm wrong about that?
No.
What's that?
It's entertainment.
It is entertaining on some level.
I think a good debater can sometimes bring the points that need to be detailed so that people can really think what the consequences of their thoughts and actions.
I agree. A skilled debater should be able to do that. I just don't know that in public forum debate, open air debate, that happens a lot.
No, it doesn't.
I mean, I've watched at least 10 to 15 different debates between atheists and creationists, between people taking up different sides of the Bible version issue, all different things. And almost every time, very rarely do I walk away saying, oh, wow, that was a good point I didn't think about. Not because I'm so smart, but just because there wasn't anything really made there that was like earth-shatteringly new or, helpful. However, when I've read books where people have had to sit down and take the time to lay out a case, I've walked away from those experiences feeling much more enlightened with better information that I felt was demonstrated to be either true or false. Anyway, anybody else?
I think the art of debate has changed. You take debate, Stephen took debate class. Debating in a classroom setting, it's more based on how they argue something and the points that they make. But when you debate in a public, like you were saying, a public forum, it's just who can yell the loudest and who can degrade the other person more, rather than the points that they're actually making.
So in a formal debate like you're talking about there's judges that are scoring things based upon criteria of the arguments made.
Yeah, it's different. The art of debate in a class is different than public debate.
Very true. Very true. Okay, so let's look at an example here. So here's a final example where the premises are true and the conclusion is necessarily true. So, all dogs are mammals. True. All poodles are dogs. True. Therefore, all poodles are mammals. True. Okay? So here's a final example again where the premises are true and the conclusion is necessarily true. It fits, right? this syllogism is valid, and the premises are true, so the conclusion is also true, so therefore we would say that this is what? Sound. Okay? It's sound. It meets the criteria of validity, structured properly, and it meets the criteria of truth, that the premises are true and the conclusion follows from them, so we would say therefore that it's what? Sound. All right? The different types of syllogism with respect to validity and truth can thus be arranged as shown. So, I think I gave you this, did I give you this graphic on the next page? No. So let's just jot this down, right? So we start here at the top with an argument. Okay? The argument can either be what? Valid or what? Invalid. Once we determine that the argument is valid, going down the next level, the argument would either be sound or what? Unsound. So this is like a parent stem for arguments. So we have whatever argument it might be, this thing about, poodles being mammals. We first determine validity. Okay, yep, it's valid. Once we determine validity, then we have to determine the truth of the premises, etc. And then we determine, by doing that, whether the argument is sound versus what? Unsound. Okay? So, with that in mind, let's just review here. So you can see from the chart, that's the chart I just had you copied down, that there are two ways for a syllogism to be spurious. Spurious is a word meaning false, right? First, it can simply be invalid. So that would be the first level, right? First level, it's valid or it's what? If you determine it's invalid, you have to go any further. You're done, right? If you determine that it's valid, then you have to determine is it sound versus what? So there's two ways for any argument to be false. The first one is that it's invalid. The second is that it's what? Unsound. Those are the two ways an argument could be spurious. It's either invalid or what? Unsound. So, that's what we just said there. A syllogism is valid if the truth of the conclusion follows from the truth of its premises. If a syllogism has true premises and a false conclusion, we say it is what? Invalid. All right? The validity of a syllogism is not the same thing as the truth of the conclusion. So remember, validity does not equal what? So sometimes you'll see that abbreviated like this. V with an equal sign with a slash through it does not equal what? T. So V does not necessarily equal T. Validity does not necessarily equal truth, right? A syllogism may be valid and have a false conclusion. So we've looked at that. And last here, or almost last, it may be invalid and have a true conclusion. Okay? So we got a couple different scenarios going on here, which is why we got to be careful in the way we think through things. Or, as in a sound syllogism, it may be valid and have true conclusion. So those are the options when it comes to this. So in terms of something being spurious or false, there are two ways. The first is that it's invalid. If it's invalid, do you even have to look at truth? No. The second then is you consider truth to determine whether or not it is sound or not. Okay? Any questions? So I had a space, so I'm getting ahead of myself. Validity then depends only on the form of the argument. This is the important point. Validity depends only on the form of the argument. Is the argument structured the way that it's supposed to be? So we basically already done all the practice. I know there's a spot there for that, but I kind of jumped the gun on that, and we just did the practice anyway. So let's talk in this time we have left about testing syllogisms. So remember the example I just gave, right? So in math, you're taught that you can test or prove your work. So again, if I have 6 minus 3, what's the answer? 3. How would I check that? I would take 3 plus what? 3 to see if it equaled what? 6. So you can test your work in math in that way, right? So when we test a syllogism, it's the same sort of a concept as testing your work in math, okay? It's a little bit different, obviously, but it's the same premise. So, the validity of a syllogism is determined solely by the form, as I've already said. Validity is not determined by the meaning of the individual statements. So validity is not determined by the meaning or the truthfulness of the individual statements. It's determined by the form. I've already said that a bunch of times. So, certain forms are always valid, and other forms are always going to be what? Invalid by nature of structure and form. Okay? So, there are many ways to test the validity of a syllogism. Alright? We will concern ourselves with 2. And I believe I added, did I not add in the notes that we're only going to look at one of these today? Yeah, so I say we'll cover rules in a future what? Lesson. Okay, so the one example that we're going to talk about here is we're going to look at a counterexample. Okay? So testing by counterexamples is accomplished through the substitution of terms. Now we kind of already did this, but we're going to make sure we look at it again. So, premise 1 in this syllogism, some Christians are not critical thinkers. Unfortunately true, okay? Premise 2, some humanists are not critical thinkers. I'm going to say that's also true. Therefore, some humanists are Christians. I'm going to say that's false. If you're a humanist, you believe man is the measure of all things. You're probably an atheist. You probably don't believe in God, and so therefore you're probably not what? A Christian. I suppose you could have, depends on your definition of humanist, I suppose, but generally I'm going to say that's false. Okay? Now, let's look at the evaluation here. Now, this syllogism is invalid. Recall that a syllogism with true premises and a false conclusion is necessarily invalid. So, true, false conclusion, we're going to say this is what? Invalid. All right? Now, we could test this, though, is the point here. If we were to substitute the terms in this syllogism such that the premises were obviously true and the conclusion obviously false, we would show the syllogism is invalid. So we kind of already did this at least once by switching out the terms, but we need to make sure that we do this again. Okay? So here's what we're going to do this time. For this example, let us substitute women, men, and lawyers for Christians, humanists, and critical thinkers. Okay? So on this slide, we had our original argument, which was some Christians are not critical thinkers, some humanists are not critical thinkers, therefore some humanists are Christians. So what we're going to do to test that is we're going to substitute terms. Okay? We're going to have men, women, and lawyers for Christians, humanists, and critical thinkers, and we're going to look at the argument now in this form. Some women are not lawyers. Some men are not lawyers.
That's layers, though.
We'll disregard the typo. Mark that I need to fix that, please. Therefore, some men are women. Now, some people think that's true, but
Yeah.
we don't happen to agree with that. Okay? So, you see what we did? We substituted out. So, anytime we had Christians, we put in what? So this was originally Christians and we added in women. Okay? No. Humanists. For humanists, we added in what? Men. So that would have originally been an H. And for critical thinkers, we swapped in what? Lawyers. So this was originally CT or critical thinkers, which my pen's not cooperating. Okay? So in substituting out the terms, do we get nonsense? And that's what this is. This is nonsense. Anyone that asks you to accept that is asking you to accept things contrary to fact. Men are not women and women are not men. Despite what society might say, that's not the case. I'm sorry, factually, biologically, etc., that it's not the case, right? So what we did is we took this and we demonstrate that the form of this argument was nonsense by making term changes and showing that to be the case. Okay? Does everybody understand what we did? So we're testing the syllogism for validity by changing out the terms. Both syllogisms have the same form. So this goes to Amy's point earlier. Okay? The original syllogism back here, let me go put it back up, has this syllogism that we tested by making the changes, men, women, and lawyers, is the same form of argument as the one that we changed it to here. Okay, so both syllogisms have the same form and are therefore both valid or both what? Invalid. The second has an obviously absurd conclusion, though both premises are true. Some women are not lawyers and some men are not, but is the conclusion counter to fact. Okay? And so by switching out the terms, it helps us to see that this form of argument is valid or invalid. It's invalid. Okay? Now, if both premises are true, and they are, and the conclusion is false, which it is, then the problem has to be with the form of what? The problem here is with the form of the syllogism. That is, this form of argument is not what? It's not valid, it's what? Invalid. So, switching out the terms to test the validity is similar to what I did when I said 6 minus 3 is what? 3. And we test it by adding those two together and realizing that when you add 3 plus 3 together, it does equal what? 6. So it's a test to see the validity by switching out the terms. Okay? Where are we at on this? So, let's consider another example and counterexample. So here's the first one. No man is immortal. True or false? We're going to say true. Some angels are not men. So, the Bible, we're going to lay aside the fact that the creators of this curriculum probably have not studied angels, and that angels in the Bible are always described as what? Men, right? Yeah. When an angel appeared in the fiery furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is described as what? A man. Okay? So, we'll just lay that aside for the sake of this discussion. Okay? Some angels are not men. The way that's stated, is that true or false? We'll put true for now and see what we think when we're done. Therefore, some angels are immortal.
Well, they are.
The issue is some versus what? But this statement says what? Some. Okay? So let's look at this. So to test with a counterexample, we want to construct a syllogism with the same form, but with true premises and a false conclusion. Okay? So they're saying here that this conclusion is what? False. Okay? And I think it's going to be false. I'm just theorizing here, even though I've already looked at it, because of the use of what? Some. Well, we'll see. We could do this. No dogs are horses. So we're substituting dog for what? Man. Okay? And we're substituting horses for what? Immortal. Okay? Some cats So we're substituting cats for what? Angels. So, no dogs are horses. True or false? True. Some cats are not dogs.
All cats are not dogs.
Okay? Therefore, some cats are horses. False. Okay? So, it is much easier to see the problem with the second syllogism than with the first. How many agree with that? When you make these changes in terms from man to dogs and immoral to horses and angels to cats, it's much more readily apparent here that this is what? Invalid than it was looking at it on the first initial example. So by swapping out the terms, can we test the validity of the statement? Or the validity of the syllogism, I mean to say, right? So it's much easier to see the problem with the second syllogism than with the first. Nevertheless, they both have the same what? Form. No statement, no statement. Some statement, some statement. Therefore, therefore, right? So is the form the same? Okay? So they stand or fall together. If the second is invalid, then so is which one? The first one, because they have the same what? Form. No animals are immortal. No dogs are horses. Is that the same form? The terms are different, but is the form the same? Some angels are not men. Some cats are not dogs. Terms are different, but is the form the same? Okay? So we're testing validity by this type of practice. Okay? So
you have to be careful if you use the word some, because some implies both.
You got to be careful if you use the word all, or if you use the word what? Some. So I used the illustration already in a previous lesson. My wife will say, you always do this. Right? Well, it's true that I sometimes do that, but do I always do it? Probably not. I might do it more often than not. I might do it habitually, frequently, but not always. You see what I'm saying? Like, what logic is doing is it's forcing you to be specific about this stuff. Okay? And that's not the way that we talk conversationally. When we talk conversationally, we very often will say things like, well, you know, all those Michigan State fans are blah, blah, blah. Well, is it true that all of them are probably that way? No, it's not. If you said some of them are, but that's not as powerful of a statement to say some of them are this way than it is to say what? All of them are this way. It's like another example is, if I used this example too, I think a couple weeks ago. If my kids ate all of the cookies in the box, that means what? They're all gone. If they ate some of them, that means there's still somewhat left. Okay? So, yeah, the forms matter a lot in determining the validity of something. Okay? Does that make sense? All right, so we're going to cruise, so practice. Suppose you want to write a counterexample for this statement. Okay? So we got time for just this. Actually, that clock is fast. I'll try to squeeze this in here. Then we're going to have to quit. Suppose you want to write a counterexample for this statement. All Paul's writings are first century compositions. Seems what? True. Some epistles are not Paul's writings. Seems what? True. Therefore, some epistles are not first century compositions. I'm going to say false with a question mark because I think all the epistles were written in the first century. But anyway, so let's look at it this way. To write a counterexample, we start by making the conclusion false, because I think the conclusion is false. So let's look at this down here. Therefore, some students are not people. That's obviously what? False. Okay? If we substitute students for epistles and people for first century compositions, we get the following, okay? All, where was I? I feel like I messed something up there. So I'm substituting out students for epistles, right? Boy, I think I made a mistake on that one. Let me check something. Sorry about that.
But like, in that statement, where you're defining your terms, you have to maybe go further and define what an epistle is. You were arguing,
I had this written
you
down
were
already.
arguing with someone, and then they what's an epistle?
I had a note somewhere in this, and I might have accidentally. I had the teacher book right here. I might have wrote it in the student book, which I didn't bring. So anyway, so all Paul's writings are first century epistles. So we're substituting out. Okay, if we substitute students for epistles and people for first century compositions, so all Paul's writings are people. That doesn't really.
I think you have to substitute Paul's writings for something else.
I do too, but it doesn't.
You don't have it.
Oh, here it is. If we substitute students for epistles, and that's what I have. Anyway,
We need three things.
We need three things.
Not two, so that's where it gets confusing.
and they're not giving me a third, that's the problem. So you want to make one up?
All Pauls are people.
Well, we're kind of running out of time, so. I think you're right, Amy. We need a third term to do it, and they didn't give it to me, and I'm not thinking well on my feet at the moment. So we'll just say this: the conclusion is false. Okay, since all students are people, we know that because we can already go to the conclusion and see that. Okay, so we simply need a middle term to make the premise true. So the example then is obviously, is this valid or invalid? Is it valid that therefore some students are not people? That can't be valid. Okay, so we're talking again here then about an argument that's what? Invalid in structure. So I apologize for the awkwardness of that last example, but I blame the curriculum. Sure, this is what it says: if we substitute students for epistles and people for first century. That's all it
We need
says.
something for Paul's writings.
Yeah, we need something for Paul's writings.
So if you substitute children's books.
Let's do it. All children's books are people. Some students are not people. Therefore, all students are not. It's crazy. It doesn't make any sense, and that's the point, right? It's invalid. So you guys have a couple more examples there. Amy, do you want to say anything else?
Me?
Yeah.
No.
Okay. So if you go to page 4, there's two more examples of this that you could test this on your own time. The substitution of terms and an explanation of the results of that. Okay. So next, the point of this lesson, we can go to the conclusion here, is that an invalid argument may be exposed through the use of a counterexample, right? So you can check it like you would check math, right? A counterexample is a syllogism of the same form as the original argument, but with obviously true premises and an obviously false conclusion. So, sorry for the last example not being great, but I think we have done enough for you to get the point. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Okay, next week Nate will be back and teaching, and then from here on out, I think we're basically going to go pretty much every other week. So if you need to refresh this, I would encourage you to check those examples yourself on page 4 and work through those just as a way of sort of testing yourself what we've covered here.